Testament heroes. Adam, made in God's image. Today's verse is Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image and likeness, and let them rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the tame animals, over all the earth, and over all the small crawling animals on the earth."
God gave Adam and Eve a choice. Trust Him or trust the voices they heard around them. They chose poorly, and sin entered the world. Sin is when we ignore God, when we go our own way. Sin entering the world changed everything. Because of who God is so pure, sin cannot be near Him. Now that serpent knew that. He was trying to hurt God, and he knew if he could get Adam and Eve to sin, then they couldn't be close to God. God's most beloved creatures would have to live their lives apart from Him. So even though it made God very, very sad, Adam and Eve had to leave the garden and live new lives in a wild, mean world.
Noah. God remembered Noah. Today's verse is Genesis 8:1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild and tame animals with him in the boat. He made a wind blow over the earth, and the water went down.
Sin has a way of spreading, so much so that one of Adam and Eve's sons turned on his brother and killed him.
Oh no!
Then there were more and more people and more sin until God's creation was drowning in sin. God decided the only way to keep His creation from drowning in sin was to drown the sin. So He flooded the whole world. But He chose one family, led by one man, to start over. That's right. Noah had tried to avoid sin all his life so he could be closer to God. He wasn't perfect, but he was a good man who listened for God's voice. That's why God chose him to start things over. Him and a bunch of animals, of course.
Who came in by twosies.
Except for the ones they used for food. They came in by sevensies. You see, Noah trusted God and listened to God, and God used his family to start over again, to give His creation a second chance. After the flood, Noah's family was still living in a broken world full of temptation to do your own thing.
Abraham. God made 3 promises. Today's verse is Genesis 17:7. I will always keep the promise I have made to you and your descendants, because I am your God and their God.
God launched His rescue plan by tapping Abram on the shoulder. Abram heard a voice say, "Leave your father's house and go to the land I will show you." Abram figured this voice was God and thought he better listen to him. So he and his wife Sarah left Ur and wandered off following God's voice. God had found a man who would listen to Him, so He made Abram 3 promises. First, He said, "You will be the father of a great nation." Second, He said, "Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." Something very good would happen to the whole world because of Abram. Finally, God told Abram He would give his children their own land, the land of Canaan. They called it the Promised Land. To celebrate these big promises, God gave Abram a new name, Abraham, which means father of many.
Abraham and Isaac. God was faithful to His promise. Today's verse is Hebrews 11:17 through 19. Abraham had been promised that Isaac, his only son, would continue his family. But when Abraham was tested, he had faith and was willing to sacrifice Isaac because he was sure that God could raise people to life.
And God gave him a son. Now, our faith grows the most when it's tested. So God asked Abraham if he would give up his son. As Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac to give him up to God, God sent an angel to stop him. And then He provided a ram for the sacrifice to take Isaac's place. Now God knew that Abraham trusted Him completely. And Abraham and Isaac's faith grew because they knew God would keep His promises always.
Joseph. God was with Joseph. Today's verse is Genesis 39:21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison.
Jacob trusted God too, and God gave him a whole mess of sons. His favorite was Joseph. So they decided to get rid of Joseph once and for all by selling him. Joseph ended up in jail in Egypt, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. But God remembered his promises to Abraham, and he used Joseph to save Egypt from a famine. That means no food. And he became the right-hand man to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Joseph was the second most powerful man in all of Egypt.
That's amazing!
God even used him to save his brothers and the rest of his family from the famine and bring them to live with him in Egypt. And his brothers were so amazed, all they could say was,
Moses. God helped Moses. Today's verse is Exodus 3:11 and 12. But Moses said, Who am I to go to the king and lead your people out of Egypt? God replied, I will be with you, and you will know that I'm the one who sent you.
To go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And Moses says, I don't want to. And God says, I want you to. And Moses says, I can't. And God says, you can. And Moses says, will you come with me? And God says, of course I will. And so Moses goes back to Egypt to face down Pharaoh.
This is a story about a man who faced a stubborn king that didn't understand that when you park your stubborn self right in God's way, let's just assume you're gonna have a lousy day. Oh, there were gnats and frogs, and the river turned to blood, and there were flies and boils, and the cows fell with the thud, and then the locusts came and ate up all the crops, and there was hail and darkness, but he wouldn't stop saying no.
Joshua. God was always with him. Today's verse is Joshua 1:9. Remember that I commanded you to be strong and brave. Don't be afraid, because the Lord your God will be with you everywhere you go.
Joshua is a medium-sized book with 24 chapters that divide into 4 parts. Part 1 is about Joshua finally leading the Israelites across the Jordan River and into Canaan, the Promised Land.
Other kings, they didn't care that God was giving that land to the Israelites. They wanted it for themselves.
The first big city they fought was Jericho. You've heard of Jericho, right? And he kept fighting with them all throughout the Promised Land until God's promise of their own land had come true.
The Judges. God sent helpers to Israel. Today's verse is Judges 2:16. From time to time, the Lord would choose special leaders known as judges. These judges would lead the Israelites into battle and defeat the enemies that made raids on them.
Well, you've got Othniel and Ehud, Shamgar and Deborah, Gideon and Tola, Jair and Jephthah. Who could forget about old Ibzan, or Elon and Abdon, and the most famous of them all, that bonehead dude named Samson.
Ruth and Naomi. God provided a redeemer. Today's verse is Ruth 3:12. Boaz said, And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I.
Once upon a time, there was a woman named Ruth. She wasn't an Israelite. She was from Moab, a country Israel didn't like very much. But Ruth, she married an Israelite. As our story begins, Ruth, her Israelite husband, and her husband's mother were all living in Moab because there was a famine in Israel. So there they are in Moab when, oh no, Ruth's husband dies. I don't know what happened. Maybe he got hit by a bus. Okay, maybe he got hit by a cow. A goat? Yes, sir. An ill-tempered iguana? Anyway, he's dead. He's gone. No more husband.
Now, Ruth's mother-in-law, her name is Naomi, she doesn't have a husband either. He died a while back, probably another iguana or something. Naomi doesn't really belong in the Moab. She's an Israelite. So as soon as the famine ends, she decides to go back to Israel. Of course, she is old and has no husband and no money, so she'll have to beg for food. Her life will be sad. Well, guess what? Ruth doesn't want that to happen. She loves Naomi, so even though Moab is her home, Ruth says to Naomi, I will come with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Isn't it beautiful? Gets you right in the gut. Anyway, this amazing Ruth, she leaves her home and goes to Israel with Naomi to take care of her. Every day she follows the workers in the fields to pick up little bits of grain to share with Naomi. Oh, I'm losing it, but get this. This is the best part. So she's picking up bits of grain in a field that belongs to a wealthy man named Boaz, who happens to be related to Naomi's old husband, the one that died in the iguana accident. Whatever. Anyway, Boaz sees Ruth in the field and hears about what she's done for Naomi. He hears about her great love for her mother-in-law. And get this, he falls in love with Ruth. Wonderful Ruth! And Ruth and Boaz end up getting married, and Boaz takes care of Ruth and takes care of Naomi, her mother-in-law, and everyone is happy, and they burst into song. Ever since I saw you, I knew that I loved you and will be together always and forever.
Samuel. God spoke through him. Today's verse is 1 Samuel 3:19. As Samuel grew up, the Lord helped him and made everything Samuel said come true.
Samuel is the last of Israel's judges. He's also a prophet.
He's the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz, King David.
So Samuel finds King David.
No, not at first anyway. David wasn't ready to be king yet. He was just a kid.
So, God rejected him as king. Today's verse is 1 Samuel 15:22. Tell me, Samuel said, does the Lord really want sacrifices and offerings? No, He doesn't want your sacrifices. He wants you to obey Him.
He had Samuel pick a guy named Saul, who was really tall and really impressive, and he became Israel's king.
So Samuel went and crowned a king, a feller named Saul. His royal look was just the thing, and man, that guy was tall. His arms were strong, his hair was thick. He whooped the Philistines right quick. King Saul, they cried, is mighty slick. We're glad that he succeeded. A king is what we needed.
Sometimes Samuel would tell him what God wanted him to do, and he would do the exact opposite. Saul was a big, strong, brave guy, but when it came to following God, he was a failure. Saul said, look at all the impressive things I've done, the battles I've won, all the sheep and cattle I've captured from our enemies. But Saul had forgotten that God doesn't want us to be impressive. He wants us to be obedient. He doesn't want to hear excuses. He wants us to listen to his voice and do what he says. Since Saul hadn't done that, the crown couldn't stay in his family. God was going to find a new king for Israel.
David. God made him a promise. Today's verse is 2 Samuel 7:13. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
The bucket, and that was when was it that David came back into town? The people of Judah knew what they should do and gave David the crown. Israel's king, see here's the thing, decided to start a feud Eventually, the people said, Dave, please be our king too. David the king did a lot of good things, you know what? He got it done. Like moving the capital city to Jerusalem from Hebron, and bringing the Ark of the Covenant up to its rightful place too. Just remember, don't touch it or it's curtains for you.
Solomon, God made him wise. Today's verse is 1 Kings 3:11 and 12. So God said to him, "Since you asked for wisdom to make the right decisions, I will do what you asked. I will give you wisdom and understanding that is greater than anyone has had in the past or will have in the future."
As a king, Solomon was incredibly wise. He always knew what to do, and his good decisions made Israel very wealthy. They had tons of gold and silver and horses and chariots. He was so wise, other kings and queens came from all over the world to hear what he had to say. His wisdom made him wealthy and famous throughout the world. A wonderful temple in Jerusalem. The inside was covered with gold, and it took 7 years to build. When it was finished, Solomon's temple became the place where Israel gathered to honor God and ask for forgiveness for their sins. It was the most beautiful building anyone had ever seen.
Jeroboam and Rehoboam. God split Israel in two. Today's verse is 1 Kings 12:24. Don't go to war against the people from Israel. They are your relatives. Go home. I am the Lord, and I made these things happen. Rehoboam and his army obeyed the Lord and went home.
One day, God sent a prophet to Jeroboam with a message. The prophet said that because of Solomon's sin, God was going to take Israel away from him and give it to Jeroboam. That Jeroboam would be the new king.
Oh my! What'd Solomon think about that?
He wasn't too happy. When he found out, he wanted to have Jeroboam killed. So Jeroboam had to hide in Egypt until King Solomon finally died. After Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became king. All the Israelites came to him and said, "Your father worked us very hard. If you are more kind to us, we'll follow you as our king." To his friends, the guys he'd been partying with in high school, and asked them what he should do. They said, "Hey man, you're the king. Show them who's boss." So Rehoboam went back to the Israelites and said, "You think my dad worked you hard? Wait till you see how hard I'm gonna make you work." The Israelites said to Rehoboam, and I'm paraphrasing, "Phooey on you! We're not gonna follow you anymore." And they made Jeroboam their new king.
Just like the prophet had said.
Elijah, God proved he is real. Today's verse is 1 Kings 18:36. When it was time for the evening sacrifice, Elijah prayed, "Our Lord, you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Now prove that you are the God of this nation and that I, your servant, have done this at your command."
God was tired of his children worshiping Baal, and he wanted to show once and for all that he was the true God and that Baal was a fake. So he had Elijah challenge 450 of Queen Jezebel's prophets of Baal to a little contest. Elijah had them build 2 altars. An altar was a pile of stones where they would burn a sacrifice for God, either grain or an animal they'd use for food. In this case, it was 2 bulls. They put wood on the altar for the fire and then the sacrifice on top of that. Usually now the priests would light the wood on fire to burn the sacrifice, but Elijah said, "Nope, we're not going to start the fires. Instead, all you prophets of Baal call on Baal to light the fire, and I'll call on Israel's God. Whichever God lights the fire is the real God." Called on Baal all morning. They screamed and shouted. They jumped around. They even beat themselves up and cut themselves with swords to get Baal's attention. but nothing happened. After a few hours, Elijah started making fun of Baal. He said, maybe your God is asleep, or maybe he's in the bathroom. Now it was Elijah's turn. Only to make God's power even more clear, he drenched his altar with water. The sacrifice, the wood, everything, all soaking wet. Then Elijah prayed and said, answer me, O Lord, so that these people will know that you, O Lord, are God. Boom! Fire came down from heaven. It burned up the sacrifice, burned up the wood, and even burned up the rocks and the water that was on the ground.
All the people fell on their faces and cried out, the Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!
Isaiah, God sent him. Today's verse is Isaiah 6:8. And I heard the voice of the Lord, saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me.
We're talking about a very famous prophet, a man named Isaiah. God used Isaiah to deliver messages from about 740 BC until around 680 BC. In other words, from about 20 years before the northern kingdom was destroyed until about 40 years after.
Cyrus, God sent his people home. Today's verse is Isaiah 44:28. I am also the one who says, Cyrus will lead my people and obey my orders. Jerusalem and the temple will be rebuilt.
Through his prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, God told the Israelites they would be in exile for 70 years until a new king came into power who would free them. God even told Isaiah the new king's name, Cyrus. Sure enough, about 70 years after the first Israelites were carried into exile, the Persians conquered Babylon, and the new Persian Empire was born, the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And most amazingly, the Persian king's name was Cyrus. Looking outside the Bible, though, first-century Jewish historian Josephus tells us that King Cyrus had actually read Isaiah's prophecy and was so amazed that Isaiah's God knew about him that he made sure to do exactly what the prophecy said he would do. The book of Ezra starts with King Cyrus telling the Israelites they can go home and rebuild God's temple.
Ezra, God did not believe his people. Today's verse is Ezra 9:9. We are slaves, but you have never turned your back on us. You love us, and because of you, the kings of Persia have helped us. It's as though you have given us new life. You let us rebuild your temple and live safely in Judah and Jerusalem.
Ezra was a priest of Israel still living in Babylon. He was an expert in teaching God's law. Suddenly, we jump ahead about 60 years, and the Persian Empire has a new king, Artaxerxes. So King Artaxerxes sends the priest Ezra back to Jerusalem to help the Israelites learn God's law again. When Ezra finally gets to Jerusalem 80 years after Cyrus first said the Israelites could go home, he doesn't like what he sees. Remember what got King Solomon into trouble? They'd been marrying women from the tribes around them that worshipped other gods. Ezra knew God's rules and knew what happened because of Solomon. He tore his clothes and pulled hair from his head and his beard to show how upset he was. Then he called out to God, confessing their sin. As the people heard him praying, they gathered together and called out to God too. They all confessed their sin. At the end of the book of Ezra, the people repent of their sin and turn back to God one more time.
Nehemiah, God gave his people strength. Today's verse is Nehemiah 4:14. Then I looked around and stood up and said to the important men, the leaders, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and powerful.
He was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Kings had to trust their cupbearers so much that the cupbearer was usually one of the king's closest friends. Another Israelite who'd been to Jerusalem told Nehemiah that the walls were in terrible shape. The Israelites had been back for almost 90 years and no one had gotten around to fixing the walls. So Nehemiah decided to do something about it. He went to King Artaxerxes and asked for permission to go back to Jerusalem. He even asked the king for all the supplies he would need to rebuild the walls. King Artaxerxes could have been upset. He could have been suspicious. He could have said, "No way, Jose, I need you here keeping me safe." But the Bible says God moved in Artaxerxes' heart, and he smiled on Nehemiah and gave him everything he asked for. His neighbors sent Nehemiah threatening letters, trying to get him to stop, but Nehemiah kept working. So they started gathering soldiers to attack Jerusalem and stop the work. But Nehemiah heard about the plan and stationed guards all around the workers to protect them. He had the workers keep their swords with them all the time, and they had trumpets to blow if anyone saw an enemy coming. Nehemiah asked God to give them strength to finish the huge job, and before their neighbors could do anything about it, Jerusalem's walls were done.
Esther, God made her queen. Today's verse is Esther 4:14. If you keep quiet at this time, someone else will help and save the Jewish people, but you and your father's family will all die. And who knows? You may have been chosen queen for just such a time as this.
So Esther was a Jew. She had no mom or dad, so she was being raised by an older cousin named Mordecai, who was also a Jew and worked for the king at his palace in Susa. Right, so Esther went to King Xerxes, and guess what? He picked her to be his queen. No, it's not. Things were great until King Xerxes made a guy named Haman his right-hand man. Haman was not a nice guy. He wanted everyone to bow to him. He said, "Bow to me, bow to me." But Mordecai wouldn't bow. Haman was so mad he said, "All right, pal, you're dead." And he went to King Xerxes to ask for permission to kill Mordecai. Haman knew Mordecai was a Jew, and he didn't like the Jews. So instead of just killing Mordecai, Haman decided to tell King Xerxes he should kill all the Jews, every last Jew in the Persian Empire. Xerxes took Haman's bad advice and told Haman he could have all the Jews killed. Haman cast lots, that's like rolling the dice, to pick the day the killing would begin. That's right, Mordecai and Esther had to do something. Since Esther lived in the palace, Mordecai figured she could go talk to the king. She went for it. She appeared before King Xerxes. Everyone watched the king to see what he would do. Was it a thumbs up or a thumbs down? It was a thumbs up! Xerxes said to Esther, "What do you want? Anything you ask, I'll give it to you, up to half my kingdom." She invited the king and Haman to a dinner party. So the king and Haman came to the dinner. Xerxes said, "What do you want? Anything, I'll give it to you." Nope. She invited the king and Haman to another dinner party the next day. So the next night, Haman and the king came back for another dinner party. And Xerxes asked once again, "What do you want? Anything, I'll give it to you." And Esther said, "No." She said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be spared and the lives of my people." And Xerxes said, "What do you mean? Who is gonna kill my queen?" And Esther said, "It is Haman. I am a Jew, and Haman tricked you into letting him kill all of us." King Xerxes flew into a rage. His servant told him Haman had built a gallows to hang Mordecai. So Xerxes said, "Whatever Haman was going to do to Mordecai, do that to Haman instead." And through the courage of a girl named Esther, God had saved his people once again. The end.
Job, God gives and takes away. Today's verse is Job 1:21b. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Job is a righteous man. He does what's right, and God has blessed him. He has 10 kids, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pair of oxen, donkeys, servants, you name it, he's got it. He loves God and follows God's rules. Then suddenly we find ourselves at a meeting called by God.
In heaven?
And God says, look at Job. He respects me and does what's right. And Satan says, he only respects you because you've blessed him. Take away his stuff and he'll curse you to your face. Scene change, back to Job. A bunch of bandits come and take all the oxen and donkeys. Then fire comes from the sky and burns up all the sheep. Then more bandits come and take the camels. Then a windstorm knocks down the house where his kids were, and they all die. Well, he was really sad. He ripped his robes and sat down in the dirt. But then he said, the Lord gave me all that stuff, and he can take it away. Blessed is the name of the Lord. Satan says, okay, but he's still healthy. Take away his good health, and then he'll curse you to your face. So back to Job, who suddenly finds himself covered with sores from head to foot. They really hurt, and Job is miserable. Job's wife comes by, takes one look at him, and says, you should just curse God and die. But Job says his wife is speaking foolishly, and he won't curse God. Then 3 friends show up who've heard about Job's terrible state. They sit quietly with him for 7 days. Then they start talking. Obviously, these terrible things have happened to you because you've done something terrible. Tell us what you've done. But Job says, I've been good. I've been following God. And the friends get a little cranky and say, bad things are punishment. If you want your stuff back, you need to stop being bad. And Job gets a little cranky and says, I told you I've been good. I don't know why God let these bad things happen to me. And Job's friends get even more cranky and say, not only have you done terrible things, but you are proud and won't admit it. You deserve all these terrible things. And Job gets mad and says, you are terrible friends saying I've done terrible things. God, why don't you defend me? It's not fair. And as they're arguing, a whirlwind shows up. The voice belongs to God. He says, who's asking questions about whether I'm doing the right thing or not? Like I have no wisdom? Like I don't know about justice? I created the world. I control the seas. I rule over all of creation with wisdom that you cannot always understand. Do you know everything that's going on right now to say that I'm being unfair? He put his hand over his mouth. He knew he had spoken of things he did not understand. He realized that God was just and wise, and God restored Job's health and gave him more kids and more camels, sheep, oxen, and donkeys than he'd ever had before. And Job kept on trusting God and being faithful to him, even when life was hard to understand.
Ezekiel. God warned his people. Today's verse is Ezekiel 39:28. Then my people will know that I am the Lord their God, because I sent them into captivity among the nations. But then I brought them back to their own land, leaving no one behind.
Ezekiel prophesied from around 593 BC until 571 BC, about 22 years. That's the same time as Jeremiah.
Ezekiel was younger than Jeremiah and was in the very first group of Jews carried off to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, which included Judah's 18-year-old king Jehoiakim. God told Ezekiel to take a brick and scratch a picture of Jerusalem onto it. He had him put it in the street and pile up dirt against it like the ramps armies build to attack a city. Then make tiny camps and battering rams around it and put an iron griddle next to it. Then Ezekiel was supposed to tie himself up in cords and lie next to the little model brick city every day for 390 days.
Jeremiah, God promises a new covenant. Today's verse is Jeremiah 31:33. Here is the new agreement that I, the Lord, will make with the people of Israel. I will write my laws on their hearts and minds. I will be their God, and they will be my people.
Jeremiah is the second book of the prophets, but he's way forward on the timeline, speaking for God from 627 BC until after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC.
Jeremiah saw wave after wave of his fellow Jews get carried off to Babylon, and then saw the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem and the temple. As the Assyrians were getting weaker, Judah had a time of peace. Things seemed to be going really well. Then along comes Jeremiah saying, "Trouble is coming, repent, turn from your wicked ways." And people would say, "Says who?" And Jeremiah would say, "Says God, I'm his prophet." And then someone else would pop up and say, "No, I'm God's prophet, and I say things are going to be great for a long time." Yep. And so everyone listened to the false prophets and ignored Jeremiah. He was so faithful to God that he just kept on preaching God's message, even though no one was listening, for 40 years, until finally all the bad things he warned them about came true.
Jonah, God sent him. Today's verse is Jonah 3:2. Get up, go to the great city Nineveh, and preach to it what I tell you to say.
Next book, Jonah. Jonah lived during the Assyrian Empire.
I know all about Jonah. God said, go to Nineveh. He went the other way. Ended up in a fish. Then went back and did what God had asked him to do.
Yep, I think everyone knows that story.
Daniel, God protected him. Today's verse is Daniel 6:23. King Darius was very happy and told his servants to lift Daniel out of the lion's den. So they lifted him out and did not find any injury on him because Daniel had trusted in his God.
Later on, when King Belshazzar, the very last king of Babylon, was having a huge feast in his palace, a hand appeared in midair and wrote a message on the wall. They were terrified, and they couldn't figure out what it said. Finally, they called in Daniel, who told them the message said Belshazzar's reign as king was ending. And that very night, Belshazzar was killed, and the Persians and Medes took over Babylon. A Mede king named Darius made Daniel his most trusted advisor. The king's other advisors got jealous and had the king pass a law that said no one could pray to anyone except the king. When they caught Daniel praying to his God, Daniel was thrown into a den of lions.
But God shut the lions' mouths and Daniel came out just fine.